The government is poised to open 3 military sites to asylum seekers as it progresses its plan to move them out of expensive hotel accommodation. Ministry of Defence sites in Bicester in Oxfordshire, Barnham in Suffolk and Linton-on-Ouse in North Yorkshire could house about 3,750 asylum seekers if planning permission is granted. The government is also looking to extend the use of existing military sites in Crowborough, East Sussex until 2030 and Wethersfield, Essex beyond 2027. The number of asylum seekers in hotels has dropped from a peak of 56,000 in September 2023 to 20,885 in March this year. That's 21% of the total. Another 72,768, 75%, were in other accommodation as they awaited decisions. What about the remaining 4%? That's 3,979 people. But in fact, this whole policy raises multiple questions. Will the new sites actually cost less? Will they make asylum claims easier to process? Will they simply make asylum seekers easier to monitor and remove? Will they avoid repeating the health and legal failures of Napier Barracks? Will concentrating thousands of people on isolated sites improve community relations or make tensions worse? The government reckons housing people on military sites will be cheaper, but that isn't self-evidently true. Military sites still require security, maintenance, utilities, catering, healthcare provision, transport links, management staff, and often significant refurbishment. The previous use of Napier Barracks in Wethersfield showed the drawbacks of trying to make old military sites fit for habitation, with disastrous consequences in some cases. The Home Office will need to demonstrate that the overall cost, not just that of accommodation, is lower than using hotels. Next, accommodation isn't the root problem. Hotels became full because of a huge backlog in asylum decisions. Unless claims can be processed much more quickly than in previous years, changing where people sleep doesn't solve the underlying issue. And we see little evidence that this is the case. Regarding monitoring and removal, military sites make it easier to know where residents are, provide security, transport people to appointments, and organise the removal of those whose claims fail. But we don't know whether the Home Office will carry out enhanced security and criminality checks before placing people in these sites, meaning it is possible that asylum seekers who may commit criminal or indeed terrorist acts, as we have seen recently, may still be allowed in. The question of whether the health and safety problems that were discovered in Napier Barracks may be repeated is a sharp one. The government needs to explain what has changed, why these sites will avoid the overcrowding and potentially fatal conditions found at Napier, and how residents' healthcare and mental well-being will be protected. So far, we haven't seen any interest in discussing that. At Napier, overcrowding and poor ventilation contributed to a major COVID-19 outbreak. The Home Office was criticised for failing to follow public health advice, and the High Court later found aspects of the accommodation and decision-making unlawful. Inspectors and charities also raised concerns about residents' mental health. And military camps were designed to house trained soldiers for relatively short periods, not people who may have experienced war, torture, or persecution themselves, and who may need access to healthcare, legal advice, and community support. The community relations aspect is huge, perhaps the most important in the minds of members of the general public. People want to know, has there been proper consultation, not just with local authorities, police, NHS trusts and voluntary organisations, but with the general public? What effect will the camps have on local services and infrastructure? Will the camps become magnets for organised anti-migrant protests, as hotels have? And how will the government protect both residents and local people if tensions develop? If Labour's objective is to reduce hostility towards asylum seekers, there's an argument that concentrating them in large camps is the wrong move. Smaller, dispersed accommodation arguably makes people less visible as a political target. Large camps are highly visible, easy to identify, and have repeatedly attracted demonstrations. The BBC's report mentions concerns raised by Liberal Democrat MP Callum Miller about the site in his Bicester and Woodstock constituency in Oxfordshire. He said the government had no credible plan about how it will manage the site and how it will maintain social cohesion. He pointed out, and I quote, "The question we are looking for the answer to is why the government thinks it is possible to put 1,250 asylum seekers into a community when the nearest village numbers 370. I've literally no idea how the government thinks that can be absorbed into the community." Whether or not one agrees with him, it's a practical planning question that deserves an answer. All of these questions lead to the big one. Is this really an immigration and asylum policy or a political publicity stunt? This comes down to whether the government is designing an asylum system that actually works, not just for asylum seekers, but for local communities as well, or simply one that is easier to administer and less unpopular. The government seems to want us to judge it solely by the number of hotels closed. Closing hotels removes one of the most visible symbols that has fueled public anger and anti-migrant protests. But will it reduce costs, avoid the health and legal failures of previous sites, speed up asylum decisions, maintain good community relations, and treat people with dignity? If it falls short on those measures, then changing the type of accommodation will have solved only the optics, not the underlying problems. If the backlog remains high, then moving people from hotels to barracks only changes the location of the problem. It doesn't solve it. The government's case won't stand or fall on how many hotels it closes, but on whether it processes asylum claims more quickly, reduces costs in real terms, and avoids repeating the mistakes that turned earlier military sites into scandals.